The moment we decide that stolen land can be bargained away, we do not end a war. We begin teaching the world that conquest works. If you allow a thief to keep what he has stolen, you are not engaging in negotiation. You are submitting to the terms set by the criminal. There is a profound moral difference between compromise and capitulation, and that difference hinges on one critical question: whose claim is legitimate? When a people have tilled the soil, built the cities, and buried their dead in the ground for generations, that land is not a bargaining chip. It is part of their very identity. To offer it away under the pretext of ending conflict is to participate in the rewriting of truth itself. Such an act does not merely change a map, it distorts history and teaches the aggressor and the watching world that force has the final say in human affairs. This is not diplomacy, it is the quiet signing of a permission slip for future violations. Some will object, insisting that in the real world, concessions are necessary to preserve life, and yet history offers a chilling counterpoint. Each concession to unprovoked force has bred more of it. The logic is as old as human conflict. When a predator tastes blood without consequence, it will return hungrier and bolder. The so-called peace, bought through territorial surrender, is a fragile and fleeting illusion, purchased at the cost of emboldening the very danger it seeks to avoid. The price is not only the land itself, but the security of the generations yet unborn who will inherit the weakened position that such a decision leaves behind. To keep what one has stolen is to enjoy the fruits of illegitimate gain, and when this is allowed, the thief is transformed from a criminal into a precedent. Others see the reward and learn the method. In the realm of geopolitics, these lessons echo far beyond the borders of the immediate conflict. Neighboring states take note. Opportunistic powers observe and wait for their moment, and the intricate network of trust and deterrence that underpins international stability begins to fray. What is surrendered in one place becomes a potential template for aggression elsewhere. There is also a deeper psychological cost to yielding stolen land. For the people who live upon it, the loss is not simply territorial, it is personal. It speaks to them of abandonment by their leaders, of a world unwilling to stand for their rights. It replaces the hope of justice with the bitter knowledge that might has been allowed to define what is right. This injury festers over time, eroding the collective spirit that nations rely upon in moments of crisis. Once that spirit is fractured, the ability to resist future encroachments is weakened from within. To refuse to legitimize a theft, even at great cost, is to affirm the principle that justice is not for sale and sovereignty is not conditional. It is to assert that the borders of a nation are not lines to be casually redrawn under duress, but the hard-won markers of a people's history, sacrifice, and dignity. Peace is often spoken of in deceptively simple terms, as if it were merely the absence of open conflict. People will say that if the guns fall silent and the bombs cease to fall, then peace has been achieved. But this view is dangerously incomplete because it mistakes quiet for justice and stillness for stability. True peace is not a passive condition where violence is temporarily halted. It is an active state in which the fundamental rights of individuals and nations are recognized, protected, and preserved. Without justice as its foundation, peace is nothing more than a pause before the next eruption of conflict, a fragile ceasefire that leaves the underlying wounds unhealed and the causes of violence unaddressed. A society can be free from immediate bloodshed and yet live under a pall of injustice. Think of the occupied territory where the local population is silenced, where cultural identity is suppressed, and where the laws serve only the interests of those who took the land. In such a place there may be no visible war, but there is no peace either, only control maintained by fear and force. This is why defining peace merely as the absence of war is not only inadequate, it is misleading. It allows tyrants to claim they have brought order while standing atop the ruins of the rights they have destroyed. Justice transforms this equation entirely. Justice requires that wrongs be acknowledged and rectified, that the oppressed are given voice, and that the aggressor is held to account. When justice is woven into the fabric of peace, the calm that follows is not fragile but enduring, because it rests on the moral understanding that each person and each nation possesses an inherent right to their existence and self-determination. Such a peace does not fear dissent because it is not built on coercion. It thrives precisely because people are free to speak, to assemble, and to live without the constant shadow of oppression. This is why, when a nation is invaded, the call for peace cannot simply mean stop the fighting. If stopping the fighting leaves the aggressor in possession of stolen territory, the so-called peace that results is counterfeit. It disguises injustice as resolution and demands that the victim accept their loss as the price of calm. The silence in such an arrangement is not the quiet of reconciliation. It is the silence of resignation. The true test of peace is whether it safeguards the dignity, sovereignty, and rights of those it claims to protect. Without justice, peace becomes a tool for the strong to cement their dominance over the weak. It can be used to freeze inequality into permanence, to codify the spoils of aggression, and to turn temporary submission into a lasting condition. Real peace resists this distortion by ensuring that power is tempered by morality, that the powerful are restrained by law, and that the settlement of conflict leaves no festering wrongs to ignite future battles. The argument for yielding territory to an aggressor often begins with what appears to be a reasonable appeal to compassion. If land is surrendered, lives may be spared. On the surface, it seems pragmatic, even humane, to trade soil for safety. But this reasoning collapses under the weight of both history and human nature. Every time an unprovoked aggressor has been rewarded with what they seized, it has not brought an end to their demands. It has only encouraged them to push further. This is the central flaw of appeasement. It assumes that the appetite of conquest can be satisfied with a single concession, when in truth the act of giving invalidates the very behavior one seeks to prevent. In personal life, when a bully learns that intimidation works, their methods do not soften, they escalate. The same is true on the global stage. States and leaders who achieve gains through aggression internalize a lesson that is both simple and dangerous: force works. This lesson does not remain confined to a single aggressor. Other powers observe it, take note, and adjust their calculations accordingly. They begin to see that international law and moral outrage can be bypassed, provided one is willing to act decisively and endure temporary condemnation in exchange for permanent reward. The result is not stability, but a gradual unraveling of the norms that prevent the strong from preying openly on the weak. Yielding territory under the banner of peace also carries a corrosive moral cost. It communicates to the citizens of the nation under attack that their leaders are willing to compromise on the most sacred of duties, the defense of their homeland. For those living in the surrendered areas, it sends the even harsher message that their freedom, culture, and heritage are negotiable commodities. The human impact of such a choice extends far beyond the immediate moment. It seeps into the national psyche, fostering a sense of betrayal and deepening the fracture between leaders and the people they are meant to protect. The problem with appeasement is not merely that it fails to stop aggression, but that it resets the baseline of what is considered acceptable. What was unthinkable yesterday becomes a precedent today, and tomorrow it is a bargaining tool to be used again. When this cycle takes hold, the territory in question is no longer just a patch of land. It becomes proof that power is measured not by justice or law, but by the ability to take and hold. Over time, the principle of sovereignty is hollowed out, leaving behind a shell that can be breached at will. History's most painful lessons come from moments when appeasement was embraced as a shortcut to peace, only to be revealed as a detour into deeper conflict. By rewarding aggression, the world teaches that aggression is profitable. And once that lesson is learned, it is rarely unlearned without a far greater cost than was originally imagined. There is a persistent illusion in human affairs that those who harm us can be transformed into protectors if only we meet them halfway. If only we feed them enough of what they demand. This illusion is captured in the metaphor of the wolf and the shepherd. The wolf's nature is to hunt, to dominate, to take what it wants without regard for the needs of the flock. No matter how generous you are in offering it food from your own hand, you do not change the wolf's nature. You only teach it that you are a willing supplier of its needs. The hope that generosity will alter the instincts of a predator is not a strategy. It is a self-deception that places both the flock and the shepherd in greater danger. When applied to geopolitical realities, this metaphor becomes even more stark. An aggressive power is not driven to expansion out of simple hunger or necessity, but out of a calculated desire to reshape the world according to its own advantage. Offering it land or concessions does not reduce this desire, it confirms the wisdom of its approach. Just as the wolf grows bolder each time it is rewarded for its approach, so too does the aggressor become more confident that intimidation and force will yield results. The calculus shifts, the risks of aggression seem smaller, the rewards greater, and the willingness to escalate more certain. In feeding the wolf, you inadvertently shift the balance of power against yourself. Each concession, no matter how small, weakens your position not only in practical terms. By losing resources, strategic ground, or defensible borders, but also in symbolic terms. It signals to your adversary and to all others watching that your principles are flexible when tested, that your resistance has limits, and that under sufficient pressure you will yield. Such signals travel faster than any diplomatic declaration, embedding themselves in the decision-making of those who might one day challenge you. There is also the corrosive internal effect of this approach. When people see their leaders engaging in appeasement, they begin to question the strength of the institutions meant to safeguard them. Trust in the nation's capacity to defend itself erodes, morale declines, and the unity required to stand firm in the face of aggression begins to fragment. Feeding the wolf does not just empower the predator. It weakens the resolve of the flock, making it less able to resist the next attack. The tragedy of this mindset is that it often comes dressed in the clothing of compassion and pragmatism. Leaders and citizens convince themselves that giving up something now will save much later, that offering a little will prevent the taking of much more. But the predator's appetite is not finite. It expands with every successful hunt. The moment it learns that your gates open with enough pressure, the attacks will not end. They will simply change in scale and timing, always returning until nothing remains worth taking. When a nation like Ukraine refuses to gift land to an invader, it is not acting out of blind obstinacy or wounded pride. It is making a declaration about its very right to exist. For a people who have cultivated their soil, built their cities, and shaped their identity over centuries, territory is not just geography, it is history, heritage, and home. To part with it under coercion would be to amputate a living part of the nation's body. This is why the stance is not merely about lines on a map, but about survival itself. The moment a country agrees to forfeit land under duress, it signals that its sovereignty is conditional, subject to the will of those with greater power and fewer scruples. Such a decision would also be a betrayal of those who have sacrificed their lives in defense of that same territory. Every soldier who stood in the line of fire, every civilian who endured bombardment, did so with the belief that the fight was to protect the whole of the nation, not just the parts that could be held without discomfort. To relinquish what they defended is to tell them and their families that their suffering was expendable, that their sacrifice was a bargaining chip in a larger game. This corrodes the moral foundation of the state's legitimacy and undermines the unity that sustains resistance in the face of aggression. There is also a psychological dimension to this refusal that cannot be ignored. A nation under siege draws strength from its shared conviction that its cause is just and non-negotiable. The refusal to hand over territory sends a message not only to the aggressor but to the world. We are not here to survive in fragments, we are here to endure as a whole. This stance reinforces the collective identity of the people, binding them together in the belief that they are fighting for something indivisible. It also serves as a deterrent, making it clear that conquest will yield no spoils, and thus stripping aggression of its incentive. For Ukraine, this position is informed by history. Generations have seen the consequences of territorial concessions. How one loss becomes the prelude to the next. How the appetite of expansion is never satisfied with a single victory. The refusal to give land away is a refusal to repeat those mistakes. It is a recognition that the only lasting safeguard against future encroachment is to deny the aggressor any reward in the present. This is not romantic idealism. It is a hard calculation grounded in the realities of power and the lessons of the past. Beyond the national interest, the stance carries broader significance for the international order. If Ukraine yields, the precedent set would ripple across the globe, encouraging others to redraw borders by force and discouraging those who might otherwise resist. To stand firm, therefore, is to uphold not only one nation's sovereignty, but the principle that sovereignty itself is worth defending everywhere it is threatened. If the use of force can erase borders, then the idea of national sovereignty becomes little more than a convenient fiction, honored only when it suits the powerful. In such a world, maps would no longer represent stable realities, but temporary arrangements, subject to change at the whim of any state willing to violate international law and absorb the political cost. The safety of nations would not be guaranteed by their legal rights or their diplomatic relationships, but by their ability to deter aggression through strength, alliances, or sheer luck. In this environment, no country could consider itself truly secure, only temporarily uninvaded, existing in a precarious state of reprieve until someone with the means and motive decides to redraw its boundaries. This is why the defense of Ukraine's borders carries meaning far beyond the region. It is not simply about the fate of one nation. It is about whether the global community is willing to uphold the principle that borders are inviolable unless changed through mutual agreement and legitimate processes. The moment that principle is compromised, It ceases to function as a restraint on the ambitions of expansionist powers. Instead, it becomes a hollow phrase, invoked selectively and ignored when inconvenient. The erosion of this principle would have a cascading effect. Smaller nations, those without large militaries or extensive alliances, would feel an immediate shift in their security calculus. They would no longer be able to rely on international law as a meaningful deterrent. Instead, they would be forced to invest disproportionately in military defense or submit to the influence of stronger neighbors. Diplomatic trust would fray, as treaties and agreements would be seen as conditional, binding only until one party decides it is advantageous to violate them. This atmosphere would foster instability, not peace. For larger powers, the collapse of respect for borders would encourage a more competitive, zero-sum approach to international relations. The temptation to settle disputes through coercion or force would grow, especially when precedent shows that the international response is limited to condemnation without meaningful consequences. The international system, already fragile, would become less about rules and more about raw capability, where justice has no place except as rhetoric used to justify actions already taken. Even within societies, the knowledge that borders can be erased by force would change how citizens think about their own identity and future. The sense of belonging to a stable nation state would be replaced by uncertainty about whether that identity will endure. This undermines not only morale but also the social cohesion necessary to build and sustain democratic institutions. Insecurity on such a scale seeps into economics, politics, and culture, shaping decisions in ways that make lasting peace harder to achieve. When the defense of borders is seen as optional, the message sent to aggressors everywhere is that conquest can be legitimized if pursued with enough determination, and patience. Negotiation is often praised as the highest expression of diplomacy, the civil alternative to violence, the arena where reason can triumph over force. But the value of negotiation depends entirely on the boundaries set before it begins. Without clear limits, the process becomes an exercise in surrender disguised as compromise. There are matters on which flexibility is wise: trade agreements, cultural exchanges, humanitarian corridors, but the right of a people to live within their own recognized borders is not among them. Once sovereignty and territorial integrity are placed on the table as bargaining chips, the very premise of the negotiation becomes corrupted. It assumes that the aggressor's claim has some legitimacy, that stolen land can be lawfully transferred if the right concessions are offered in return. The danger of such negotiations is that they shift the moral weight from the invader to the invaded. Instead of holding the aggressor accountable for the violation, the focus turns to what the victim nation is willing to give up to achieve peace. This reframing subtly recasts the defense of one's own territory as an obstacle to resolution, pressuring the defending nation to appear reasonable by making tangible sacrifices. It is a distortion of justice in which the crime is tacitly validated because it is being formally discussed as an option for settlement. History has shown that when sovereignty is treated as negotiable, the outcomes are rarely lasting. Even if an agreement is reached, the aggressor walks away with the proof that its tactics work, that the mere act of seizing land is enough to force the world into a dialogue on how much of that seizure will be legitimized. In the short term, this emboldens the current aggressor. In the long term, it signals to others that violations of borders can be rewarded through persistence and the application of pressure at the right political moment. Refusing to negotiate over sovereignty does not mean rejecting dialogue altogether. It means establishing a moral and legal baseline that defines what is beyond dispute. In the case of Ukraine, this means making it clear before talks begin that territorial concessions are off the table. Only by removing such concessions from consideration can discussions focus on legitimate topics: ceasefires, prisoner exchanges, humanitarian aid, post-war reconstruction. Anything else invites the aggressor to view the talks as a pathway to achieving what could not be fully taken by force. When leaders stand firm on this principle, they affirm that certain rights are not subject to barter. This strengthens their position not only in the immediate conflict, but also in the wider system of international law. Other nations take note that their own sovereignty, should it be challenged in the future, has defenders who understand the importance of keeping inviolable rights truly inviolable. Compromise in many areas is the lifeblood of diplomacy, but compromise on sovereignty is the slow erosion of the very foundation that makes diplomacy possible at all. When a nation chooses to surrender territory taken by force, it is not merely yielding ground. It is relinquishing the moral authority to challenge similar acts of aggression in the future. This is because such a concession carries with it an implicit admission that might can indeed determine right, That power exercised without legitimacy can still command recognition. Once that door is opened, it becomes exceedingly difficult to close. The aggressor may walk away with a physical prize, but the deeper loss is intangible, a weakening of the universal principle that sovereignty is not contingent on the strength of arms alone. The state that yields under pressure forfeits its ability to stand credibly as a defender of that principle elsewhere. Moral authority is not just a matter of rhetoric or public perception. It is the foundation upon which coalitions are built, alliances are maintained, and collective resistance to injustice is organized. Nations rally together most effectively when the cause they support is seen as clear, consistent, and rooted in values that transcend individual interests. If a country has demonstrated that it will negotiate away its own territorial integrity to secure peace, its appeals for solidarity when others are threatened will ring hollow. Allies may question whether they are being asked to defend a principle or merely to protect a partner's convenience. Potential aggressors will conclude that their actions, too, can be legitimized if pursued with enough persistence and force. This erosion of credibility has consequences far beyond the immediate conflict. On the world stage, the ability to lead morally is often as decisive as the ability to project military power. A state that has compromised its own sovereignty under coercion will find it harder to mobilize diplomatic pressure or galvanize public opinion against future acts of aggression by others. Its statements will carry less weight in international forums, and its efforts to invoke the sanctity of borders will be undermined by the precedent it set through its own concessions. This is not a loss that can be easily repaired, because moral authority, once diminished, is slow to rebuild and quick to fracture again under scrutiny. There is also an internal dimension to this loss. Citizens who have witnessed their leaders trade away parts of the homeland may struggle to believe in the same leaders' resolve when new threats arise. Trust in the government's capacity to defend national integrity is weakened, and the unifying sense of shared purpose that sustains a nation in times of crisis is eroded. This internal skepticism can be as damaging as external doubt, for it shapes the political will and resilience needed to face future challenges. By defending every inch of its territory, a nation asserts not only its right to exist, but also its willingness to uphold that right without compromise. This refusal reinforces the principle that sovereignty is absolute and non-negotiable, and it preserves the standing to insist on that principle for others when their borders are threatened. If we allow borders to be erased by force, we trade the promise of peace for the certainty of future wars. Sovereignty must remain non-negotiable, not just for Ukraine, but for every nation that wishes to remain free.